Hey everybody, welcome to Lex's World. How you all doing? Today we're going to be talking about cannabis in the news because cannabis has been sort of bubbling up into mainstream media coverage the last few weeks. I wanted to discuss with you guys all those vaping deaths that have been reported and what I think about them. I wanted to talk about Quebec overturning the ban on personal growing. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this whole Weedmaps situation where Weedmaps is no longer going to list unlicensed dispensaries on their app, which has been kind of a big news deal in the cannabis industry. But also, while we do all that discussion, we are going to be smoking out of the latest arrival to my mailbox. Looks like I've received the Freeze Pipe by Freshy Tech. And we're going to see what this thing is all about, sort of do an unboxing and smoke session as we go. Looks like when you open up the box, they give you a grinder card keychain. They give you their little instruction booklet. And it looks like these guys make a bunch of little freeze pipes. We're going to be using a regular freeze pipe, but they also make a bubbler variant of it with a big attachment. Then we get to the actual freeze pipe. Looks like they give you a little bit of a wick. The pipe has a removable bowl, so you don't have to freeze the herb, and this is a herb pipe. But we'll put the bowl into the pipe and put it out here. And this is the actual pipe. Actually, let's take this bowl out. This pipe has an interesting feature, which is glycerin liquid. And for those of you guys who watched my very old How to Use a Bong episode, in that episode I used ice to fill up the bong, and I explained that I did this because that provides you the smoothest, coolest hit when you inhale. These guys have taken that idea to a new extreme, and instead of ice, they filled this chamber with glycerin. It's a non-toxic fatty gel that cools down faster than ice would, and it stays cold for longer. So basically all you gotta do is put this pipe in the freezer for at least an hour, and then you have something that can cool the smoke by over 300 degrees. It's pretty nifty. And you can actually just leave this in the freezer long term. There's no problems with that. So what say you guys? I put this in the freezer, let it freeze an hour, and then we'll use it. All right, and here we are an hour later, and it is all frozen. You can see that the glycerin has stopped moving around. We're going to put the removable bowl in and take a hit and see exactly how this thing goes. I literally couldn't feel that there was smoke going in, so as far as cooling action, it works well. We'll take a couple more hits of this as we go, but let's get into the news topics a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to talk about with you guys is the Quebec ruling where personal growing was overturned. Now, for those of you who may not know, Canada legalized cannabis a couple years back, and personal growing was a part of that legal framework. And I've always insisted that to have any sort of legitimate cannabis legalization, you have to have personal growing as a component of that framework. Well, Quebec, a province in Canada, decided to go off on its own and ban legal recreational personal growing. And back then I predicted that that little change wouldn't last a very long time. And sure enough, in the past few days, a Quebec Superior Court judge has ruled that it's basically unconstitutional to prevent that type of at-home growing. He basically claimed that the province does not have jurisdiction to make this kind of law because they're effectively making sort of criminal legislation, which in Canada is federal jurisdiction. But in any case, now if you're in Quebec, you can grow once again, and I don't expect that that's really going to change. The Quebec government can appeal this to the Supreme Court. They haven't formally announced whether they will, but I don't expect their appeals to be particularly successful because from my standpoint, you gotta have legal personal growing. If you have home brewing of liquor and beer, then you gotta have home growing of recreational cannabis. And 4 plants is a very reasonable number. As I told you guys, Canada removed the 100 centimeter plant height limit that they initially were going to go with. So it's just 4 plants per household across the board. I think that's perfectly reasonable as well as perfectly necessary to maintain a healthy, legal, regulated ecosystem that doesn't get overtaxed or anything of that nature. Let's take another little hit here before we get into the next story, and maybe we'll even use this wick that they provided. Wicks burn slow. They don't let any butane into your lungs, so that's the advantage of the wicks. Though I rarely use them, though as you guys know I rarely combust to begin with. So let's light this guy up again. Again, couldn't feel it going in. If I didn't have confidence that it was going in, I simply wouldn't have known. Does a heck of a cooling job. Alright, our next story is this story about the vaping deaths. And I follow a lot of different news feeds, and usually cannabis is just one of the feeds, because I follow Normal and I follow a bunch of other cannabis associations. I follow the Weedtubes posts and so on. But the past couple weeks especially, cannabis has been percolating up into the mainstream media. The reason, though, has been mysterious deaths linked with vaping. There's been 6 deaths as of the date of the recording of this video in multiple states. They've occurred kind of all over the US map. There's been 450 suspected cases of this lung disease across the United States since August. And initially the headlines were blaming cannabis, because some of the people who got the lung disease were using cannabis oils in their vapes. As the story developed, it was found that actually cannabis wasn't specifically to blame, because many of the people coming down with this lung illness did not consume anything that had cannabis in it. Instead, the blame currently rests on e-cigarettes, specifically certain types of juices. People are strongly suspecting vitamin E acetate as the cause of all of these issues. Basically, that is a chemical you're not really supposed to be inhaling. Traditionally, they use it in foot creams and all sorts of other stuff of that nature. But companies, manufacturers, are putting it in e-juice. And it's believed that this is the cause of these lung illnesses, at least as of this moment. And cannabis as a suspect is thankfully off the table. Now, my personal view of all this is that this is a little bit more fear-mongering and over-the-top theatrics by the media. Whenever I get a news story come across my feed that something weird is killing people and you gotta be afraid, my first question is, okay, how many people have been killed? And right now we're looking at, since August, 6 people. And that's the suspected cases. Like, they think that these 6 people all died due to this particular illness. One of these 6 people is a person who was in their 50s with very significant underlying health issues. So we're not even sure if that 6th person counts. But to me, this is all part and parcel of the whole narrative that vaping should be feared, that vaping is bad. To me, vaping is a quite firmly healthier alternative to smoking combustion materials. And for all these articles that have been written about these 6 people who died, I mean, yeah, you know, whenever anyone dies, it's tragic. You got to bear in mind that while I've been filming this video, probably more than 6 people in the United States died directly as a result of smoking cigarettes. That's how fast smoking cigarette deaths pile up, even though vaping is extremely popular and lots of people do it. So I think this is more of a media excitement, media trying to scare people and keep them interested in the story type of thing. I don't think there's a lot to fear here. The final story I wanted to mention today, and we'll take another quick hit before we get into it. So far, it looks like the glycerin is starting to slowly loosen up. We've only kept this pipe in the freezer for right about an hour, which is the minimum they recommend. Again, very smooth. It's very cold to the touch though. Like, yikes. But in any case, the final story is about Weedmaps removing unlicensed retailers and dispensaries of cannabis off of their app. This has come after a lot of threats from the California Bureau of Cannabis. It's been sort of an 18-month process. There's about 2,800 unlicensed dispensaries in California alone, and only about, I think, 870 licensed ones. So most of them are illegal, and the way that people find them, generally speaking, especially in a place like California, is on Weedmaps. And so Weedmaps has now said it will no longer show your dispensary or your cannabis provider listing if you're unlicensed. This has been a big development. It's going to change how people do things. But again, it's been blown out of proportion. First off, there are other apps besides Weedmaps that are much smaller, but still list a lot of the dispensaries. And secondly, do you really need an app to find these dispensaries? I mean, even if Weedmaps blocks them, you could still potentially use Google search just as easily. But also, this was kind of coming. I mean, Weedmaps has been becoming more of a mainstream corporate entity, and the legal retailers have been gaining more and more leverage. And it was really only a matter of time until you could no longer have this weird situation where Weedmaps wanted to work with all the legal dispensaries, but also wanted to work with all of the illegal dispensaries. They couldn't have it both ways for all eternity. So I think this is just that coming to a head. At the end of the day, again, in California, they have legal personal growing. So if something happens to a source like Weedmaps, does it really matter? No, everything will work itself out, and I do think that it will be fine. So yeah, in my opinion, a whole lot of excitement about a whole lot of nothing. But when I see these news stories just coming at me for 2 weeks straight, and people are going, Lex, did you hear about this? Did you hear about this? I figured we'd take an episode to address them, especially because our last few episodes were kind of dry, deficiency, growing type of episodes, and I know some of you guys get tired of those as well. Anyway, that's our episode for the day. Thank you to the folks at Freeze Pipe for sending me this. I'll link down to the Freeze Pipe on those platforms where I can actually link to it down in the video description. And there's also a discount code I think we can provide for you guys to maybe get 10% off one of those. And other than that, I hope you enjoyed this quick little news and session episode. Subscribe if you did, hit that like button, and we'll see you guys next time.